For today's shipwreck video, we'll be leaving the 1940s behind. Instead, we'll be looking at a far more recent wreck, more akin to the Murmansk video, in both time frame and country of origin. Because we'll be looking at another Soviet wreck, although a much deeper one, moving from a cruiser grounded off Norway to a submarine sunk off a Norwegian island. Specifically, K-278 Komsomolets sunk at the very end of the Cold War, an accidental sinking of what was a state-of-the-art and almost brand new boat, at least by the standards of nuclear subs, which often last decades in service. This one only lasted a few years, from 1983 to 1989. As for the wreck, it's an interesting one, very intact with relatively minimal damage, and a good selection of pictures from a recent survey. I'll link the source of those in the description. However, before that, we need to talk about the sinking. That came on April 7th, 1989. As I said, pretty much at the end of the Cold War. And it was, for all intents and purposes, the nightmare scenario for a nuclear boat. As K-278 was sailing through the Barents Sea, a substantial fire broke out. While the boat was submerged at a depth of 335 meters or 1,100 feet. This fire was caused by a short circuit in engineering and would quickly spread through the submarine, although the exact cause of the blaze is debated. I've seen reference to a burst high-pressure pipe causing a spark. I've also seen reference to a spray of oil hitting a hot surface, or the crew accidentally creating a high-oxygen environment primed for a spark. We'll probably never know for sure. No matter how it started, that fire would prove fatal. While watertight bulkheads were sealed, the fire found a weakness, a chink in the armor, as it were. Penetrations in the boat for electrical cables. Those caught fire and spread the blaze through the engineering spaces. This was a double-edged problem for the Soviet crew. It spread the fire past their ability to fight, and it also burnt out electrical systems. Systems needed for controlling the sub, or fighting the fire, or simply running the reactor, which, as it turned out, scrammed. That is, performed an emergency shutdown. This cut most of the power to the boat, forcing the crew to blow the emergency ballast. This brought K-278 to the surface, where she would rest for a few hours as the crew tried to fight the fire, until eventually the fire burnt out seals around the screw. This caused progressive flooding that couldn't be fought. While most of the crew was able to abandon ship, they had to wait for a rescue. It took a little under an hour and a half for that to arrive, 81 minutes after the sub went under and hours after she surfaced. By the time the rescue arrived, only 27 of the 69 crew had survived. 9 died during the accident, while 30 died in the water from hypothermia or injuries. 3 more would die aboard the rescue boat, likely from the cold and injuries that couldn't be treated. Among the losses was the captain, Evgeny Vanin. He remained behind until the submarine began to sink. When it was apparent the boat was sinking, Vanin and 4 others boarded the emergency escape capsule. Only 1 of the 5 managed to escape it when that capsule reached the surface. Vanin was among the 4 who couldn't. This sinking was a tragedy by all accounts, especially for how much of an accident it truly was. Not combat action, not a collision or foul weather, just a fire that raged out of control. That said, we've wrapped up the sinking. So what about the wreck itself? The Soviets would find the wreck 2 months after the sinking. They located K-278 in June 1989 at a depth of 1,680 meters or 5,510 feet, about 250 kilometers, 135 nautical miles from Norway's Bear Island. At the time, the Soviets said there was no leakage of radiation. in spite of the reactor and 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes being aboard. A follow-up look in 1994 found some leakage from one of those torpedoes. This was sealed over the course of 1995 and 1996, with a seal expected to last as long as 2025, or next year as of this recording. Otherwise, the torpedoes were apparently left in place, which brings us to the third major expedition and the most recent. In 2019, a joint Norwegian-Russian team surveyed the wreck again. They found clouds coming out of a ventilation pipe for the reactor. Samples were taken directly from that pipe, which did find radiation. But no major radiation was found in water samples, which seems to have diluted the leak to the point of not being a danger, although the team was going to do more sensitive measurement of the samples to be absolutely certain. In any event, we can now look at the wreck. A bit more background than usual, but it was necessary for the full story. Now we can get to the meat of the video, beginning in this case with Sonar, which is actually quite nicely detailed. You can see the entire shape of the boat from bow to stern, which is, for the most part, completely intact. At the time this was taken, K-278 had been underwater for 30 years. There's very minimal collapse of the pressure hull outside of some damage to the bow, visible even on the sonar here. Considering the boat had a titanium inner hull, that's probably not surprising. That aside, you can also see a gap in the sail. This is very notable on the sonar and the wreck itself. This is where the escape capsule was positioned, and when it was jettisoned, it left this large gap. So this isn't damage from either the sinking or the years underwater. It's an intentional hole, as weird as that might sound, which is a good point to move to the wreck pictures themselves, starting with the sail. This picture, well, you can tell it's older. There's more paint and less corrosion. I would guess this originated in one of the Russian surveys. It's a very distinctive image regardless. The windows of the sail poking out of the darkness. You can't see much in the way of detail, but I think this one doesn't need it. It stands entirely on how haunting the image is. The next picture from further back is also from before the 2019 survey. This is further out and a less ghostly image, for lack of a better term. While the paint on the windows is still there, there's much more silt. As for the piping on the deck, I'm not sure what that is. It might be related to the sealing efforts from the Soviets. It also might be part of the sub's own equipment, exposed over the years. It's too out of frame to say for certain, and I certainly don't have blueprints of the sub to actually check that. It does admittedly look like there might be buckled hull and a gap in the deck to the side, but that also might be shadow from the ROV messing with perspective, or from mirror, depending on which survey this is. Regardless, as we move further back, we can see the navigation bridge windows. As established, the paint around those remains intact. Around it, however, there's visible marine growth. Nothing major, especially compared to other wrecks. But in real color, without the blue tint, it's very apparent, and has, more or less, covered the entirety of the sail itself. Considering this is from the 2019 survey, it's not surprising. More time for this to colonize the wreck. To round this picture off, you can also see inside the bridge. Barely. We get a better view of that later. But before that, the next picture moves to the top of the sail. This gives us a couple interesting looks. First and foremost, the gap where the escape capsule was. It's a gaping hole in the sail that we'll see inside of later. It also lets us see an entrance deeper into the sub here. That would have been on the interior when the boat was in one piece. There's another entrance that would have been covered here. The hatch is gone, but the ladder is still there. Presumably a maintenance hatch of some form. I normally guess the thing next to it is the periscope, but we have a view on the surface which shows those further back, so I'm not sure what that is. As for the next picture, it shows us the base of the capsule. You can see why this was used to evacuate the boat, because it's rather large. We can't see the capsule itself, obviously, but the gap it left is telling. And inside that gap, you can make out cabling and piping. I'm not sure if the crew could work beneath there or not, but if so, it's also a look at where the crew worked. Unfortunately, however, there's not much else to really say. There's another hole here, but there's not much detail to speak of. Not that things are much better there, at the aft end of the sail. I'm not sure when this picture was taken. Most likely not the 2019 survey, so one of the Soviet or Russian surveys. The footage is certainly grainy enough for that. Either way, it gives a good look at the deck and sail, which, at least when this was taken, was completely intact. Maybe a bit of corrosion towards the bottom, but nothing more than that. Although the 2019 survey does give us a look further up. Still not a huge amount of detail, but we can see more of the sail, which, aside from the marine growth, is pretty much the same as when she sank. There's no visible damage here. For the last two pictures of the sail, we'll move forward again. First with a closer in look. Here we can see the side of the sail where the Soviet naval ensign remains. The paint has certainly faded, but the cold water has done a good job of preserving it. It also looks like 1988 is written beneath it. I believe that's a reference to how the boat got her name in 1988. Komsomolets instead of just K-278. There's also some deck here. We'll see that better in the next picture. The deck is clearer as you can see, and there's definitely been some corrosion. It looks like the piping is part of the sub herself, although it's still difficult to say for sure. In any event, you can also see better inside the navigation bridge. Still not great, but the piles of silt are apparent. And if you go further down, you can also see an open entrance into the sail, probably left open during the sinking, although it might have been forced open. But that does round off this part of the boat. Now let's stick with the bow and look at some pretty rough damage. The deck has torn and collapsed here towards the bow. Pretty badly, in fact, with a collapse here, and a massive tear in the deck here, complete with buckled plating towards the side, and a broken pipe here. Exactly what happened isn't entirely clear. The fire damage would be towards the stern, if anything. While it's possible the fire spread all this way, I don't think this is from that. What it might be is implosion damage. The submarine sank by the stern. It's entirely possible the extreme bow still had air pockets as she descended, and the change in pressure caused the bow to implode a bit. Not to the point of completely crushing like a tin can, but certainly enough to do damage. This is, however, speculation. I can't say for sure. The same holds true as we move further back. Here we have the emergency buoy still attached, or rather, attached with air quotes you can't see. It clearly came loose from its normal mounting, although not enough to leave the boat, leaving a hole in the deck matched by some damage to the side, and some less visible damage here where deck plates are coming loose. As for the thing in front of it, I'm not sure what that is. It also seems to have come loose from the mounting. If anyone knows what that is, by all means let me know in the comments. Soviet submarines are certainly not my area of expertise. In any event, the next picture shows more of the bow damage. This is from an older survey where more color is still visible, but it's also still a mess of debris that I can't make much sense of. I'm not sure what any of this is. As for the last picture of the bow, we have one of the dive planes, along with squashed in deck panels. It looks like the dive plane is exposed. The bow around it is gone, revealing a very chromed shaft. Unfortunately, we can't see anything beyond that. It's too dark. So let's round off the video with a handful of images of the stern. First, we have what looks like a stubby torpedo on the bottom. This is actually part of the steering and auxiliary propulsion mounted to the stern planes, which you can see, although it's hard to make out here. This was a classically Soviet concept that you don't really see much on other subs. The next picture, meanwhile, shows the top of the upper rudder. There's not a huge amount to see here, other than more marine growth. But, interestingly, the rudder is turned slightly. I don't know if that was done before the sinking, or if that was twisted as she went down. Either way, it's clearly been turned. Unfortunately, the bottom rudder is buried in the mud, so we can't compare that to this one. As for the last two images, both are of the prop, or the screw. This is partially buried in the mud as well, but it's still visible enough. You can see how it's 8-bladed, for example, and like larger ships, there's no real corrosion to speak of. I'm not sure what will last longer on this wreck, the titanium in her hull or the bronze of the prop. Which brings us to the last image, from an older survey but still useful. We can better see the screw here, and just as importantly, the stern of the boat itself. There isn't any visible damage, although some of the exterior plating has fallen off. I think it's a fitting image to end on because it brings us full circle, from the sail on the bow to the very stern, where the boat is buried in the bottom, silently resting for decades. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.